Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. My name is Daniel Klinghardt. I teach in the Political Science Department, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Charles Carroll Program. For those of you who don't know, the Carroll Program promotes the study of the major themes of the American political tradition, which we believe are distinctly connected to the college's broader commitment to the liberal arts and to Jesuit education. Drawing inspiration from the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, the Carroll Program works to keep these themes at the forefront of debate on campus by investigating their roots in the Western philosophical tradition and by emphasizing their connection to contemporary issues. We have a few more events scheduled already for this semester. On October 18th at 4 p.m. in this room, we'll hear from Elliot Cohen, who will speak on the Big Stick, Military Power for What Exactly? Cohen is a national security professional and now professor at Georgetown. If you're interested in international affairs, I encourage you to sign up for that. He'll be investigating the role of America in global politics in the age of Trump. On October 26th at 5 p.m., also in this room, we will hear from Holy Cross alum and federal district court judge Richard Leon, who will talk on the subject of the Battle Hymn of the Federal Judge, which is basically Judge Leon's sort of views on his life in the judiciary. If you're at all interested in the law, I encourage you to make an effort to come to this. Like I said, he's a Holy Cross alum. My sense is he'll have some good stories to tell us about his life and some connections to his time here at Holy Cross. A few notes about today's event before I introduce Professor Hinman. This is the college's official Constitution Day event. All colleges that receive federal funding, which is pretty much all of them, are required to have an event in conjunction with Constitution Day, which was technically yesterday, September 17th, but we figured we'd give you Sunday off. This is not like one of those old holidays that goes back to the founding or back to the old days. It dates back to, I believe, 2004, when then Senator Robert Byrd felt that the debate over the Iraq War had not been sufficiently informed by constitutional principles. And so on a later funding bill, Byrd had a line inserted requiring all colleges to have a Constitution Day event. Every year we have to certify with the college's finance office that we are actually doing this event, so you are part of something very important. The second thing about today's event, it is being recorded, as you can see back there. This is not to concern you, just to let you know what's going on. So when the question and answer time comes, I hope you'll feel free to ask questions, but just so you know, there's a recording of it. That's just for your notification. And then the final thing, I encourage you to ask questions. Maybe I should have done that reverse. I encourage you to ask questions. This is the kind of event where sometimes it can feel like you're just supposed to be talked to, and maybe the professors are supposed to ask questions at the end. We want to hear student questions, and so as you're listening to the speaker, if things come up that don't quite jive with your view of events, or questions that you think need to be clarified for you to fully understand what's going on, save those for the end, and please ask them when the time comes. I would now like to introduce Alex Hinman, visiting assistant professor, teaches constitutional law and society, and principles of American government. His second year at the college, and we've enjoyed very much having him here. He's also recently the author of the book Gerald Ford and the Separation of Powers, which I encourage you all to take a look at. Join me in welcoming Professor Ford. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Klinghardt, for plugging my book. That's very good. For a small fee of 10,000 pennies, so don't go out and buy it just all at once. Like Professor Klinghardt said, my name is Alex Hinman, and it's a pleasure of mine to introduce my teacher, Professor Michael Uhlmann from the Claremont Colleges. Professor Uhlmann has held a distinguished career in government and the law before he joined the faculty at Claremont Colleges, where he teaches executive congressional relations, the federal judiciary, administrative law, and courses on the American presidency. He also directs the Claremont College's Tribal Administration Certificate Program that educates future leaders of California's Native American community in governance issues related to federal and state policies. Previously, he served on the staff of 2 U.S. senators as minority counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and then his work in Congress was followed by a brief stint as Assistant General Counsel to the Federal Trade Commission. After that, he worked in the Ford administration, the Justice Department, as an Assistant Attorney General. Left for a time, came back to government service as Special Assistant to President Ronald Reagan, where he was the Associate Director of the White House Office for Policy Development. Following his work in government, Professor Uhlmann practiced law for several years in the Washington law firm Pepper, Hamilton, and Sheets, doing a variety of things, before becoming a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Subsequently, he left the UPC to serve as the senior vice president at the Lynn and Harry Bradley Foundation, where he worked in the late 90s to improve education within communities of color in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Dr. Uhlmann is formally educated at Yale College, has a law degree from the University of Virginia, a PhD from Claremont Graduate School, and he is the editor of a book entitled Last Rites, Assisted Suicide and Euthanasia, which explores many end-of-life issues related to the legal realm. Additionally, he's a prolific writer, writing for the Washington Post, First Things, the Los Angeles Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Weekly Standard, National Review, and the Claremont Review of Books. It is my great pleasure to present my teacher to you to talk about the Constitution today.
Thank you, Alex, for that very generous introduction, and my thanks to Don Brand and Daniel for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here at your wonderful college. I'm honored to be here, and particularly honored to be here under the auspices of the Charles Carroll program, which over the years has done much to enlarge and refine views on pressing public policy issues. Can't have too much of that, and the Carroll program does it very well. Some of you may know that Charles Carroll and his cousin John Carroll, first Archbishop, the first Catholic Archbishop in the United States, they were cousins, were both close friends of George Washington. He admired them greatly and had correspondence with both of them, and at one juncture used them both in an important diplomatic mission to Canada. So there's a good traditio here that's worth imitating. It's not merely related to churchly matters, but has a political effect as well. And so the connection of the Carrolls to the American founding is not incidental. Although this is my first visit to Holy Cross, I'm not unacquainted with its virtues through alumni who sat where you now sit, so to speak. And most prominent among them, my very good friend, and I dare say your most distinguished graduate, Justice Clarence Thomas. Justice Thomas's affection for this school is wide, deep, and enduring, and indeed his education here had a similar effect on his character and intellect, as he would be the first to say. But don't take my word for it. Before you leave here, you should read his autobiography, My Grandfather's Son. It's a remarkable work. It is testimony to the moral virtues, especially courage, and above all, an affirmation of the healing power of divine grace. This is a great souled man who wrote a wonderful book, and in its own way, it's a wonderful tribute to this college and what it stands for at its best. So do yourself a favor, read the book before you leave here and learn about Holy Cross at its best and about one of its greatest graduates. You may have observed that Justice Thomas knows a thing or two about the Constitution. You may also have observed that he is an increasingly forceful and articulate defender of constitutional originalism. It can be said of Justice Thomas that he reveres the Constitution in the same way that English Prime Minister William Gladstone did in the 19th century, the great man said, "It is the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man." Gladstone's praise was perhaps a bit hyperbolic, but it captured the sentiment that was, until fairly recently, the common coin of public discourse on constitutional matters, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. That is not, alas, the fashion these days in many schools and in much of our news media, where the Constitution's inadequacies are more likely to be addressed than its considerable virtues. I will touch passingly on how that change came about. The question deserves more thoughtful attention than I can devote to it today. Let me be blunt about the nature of my concern. It is simply this: a citizenry that is taught to denigrate its Constitution will soon find that it does not have one, which is to say that it will in time replace the rule of law with the rule of men. I begin by expressing gratitude to those courageous men who pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor in defense of the moral proposition that undergirds the Constitution. The proposition, namely, that there is an order of rights antecedent to the state, which the state must respect as a condition of its legitimacy. That idea is, of course, embodied in the famous second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, with which, of course, you are all familiar. The framers advanced this proposition at great personal peril against the settled opinion of powerful rulers who believed the Declaration's argument was so much twaddle. All hail to the founders then, and especially to George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. Without them, there would be no United States of America. All hail in equal measure to Abraham Lincoln, who during the gravest crisis this nation has ever known, a crisis that turned precisely on the question whether the teaching of the Declaration remains true, Mr. Lincoln in that crisis gave the nation a new birth of freedom. Having bowed my head and recited political grace, so to speak, I turned down to the main course. Why study the American founding? Let me commend 3 reasons to you. First, the founding is endlessly interesting. It has a dazzling cast of characters, including 3 or 4 certifiable geniuses who have earned a place of honor among the greatest figures of modern times. Some of them, I'm told, even knew how to speak hip-hop. You don't have to take my word for it. If you have $400, you can go to New York and see for yourself at the Richard Rodgers Theater. The storyline of the founding, moreover, matches that of the best novel you've ever read. It has passion, drama galore, all sorts of unpredictable ups and downs and ins and outs, improbable military victories, tales of love, friendship, vanity, and betrayal, as well as extraordinary valor and statesmanship. It features compelling personalities, some of the most brilliant political writing ever penned, fiery debates between well-matched adversaries, high-stakes political intrigue, and gripping suspense at almost every turn. All that and one thing more. It has a happy ending. At least for us, if not for our British cousins. Most of the founders were extraordinarily well-read men, and for a group of practical politicians, even a bookish lot. But they were hardly men of the cloister. They were also highly skilled politicians who knew how to count heads, and when flexibility was required, could cut a deal faster than Donald Trump with his 2 new best friends, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. But as essential as practical skills and deal-making are to political art, the most remarkable things about the framers were their courage and knowing when not to compromise when important principles were at stake. Happily for us, they wish to be known to posterity for the nobility of their actions. They not only saw themselves as founders, they wished to be known as founders. That is why they went to unusual lengths to tell us what they thought. The size of the written record they bequeathed to posterity is astonishingly large. I have never calculated a precise number, But it's probably safe to say that if you took only the major founders and collected the written record of their words and deeds, you could in no time at all easily assemble a library of 1,000 volumes or more. Nothing remotely like that exists anywhere in the archives of political societies. And it's all there for you to examine, to argue with, to debate, and to think about. A second reason to study the founding is that it's not only a piping good story about an epoch-defining series of events, it also happens to be our story, which is to say that the founding may be studied appropriately for reasons of patriotic pride. No, they didn't get everything right, but I think they got most of the big things right. It's easy enough to fault them from the perspective of later decades and centuries, most conspicuously for failing to solve the slavery problem. But in the annals of human endeavor, establishing a free nation that lasts more than a brief time is not only a noble task, it is arguably the most arduous of human labors, harder even than climbing Mount Everest when you're blind. That's been done. I've met the man who did it. Harder even than ascending El Capitan without ropes or harnesses. I have not met the man who did it, but you should watch the YouTube and hold your breath while you do it. Establishing a successful political society is harder than both of those deeds. Whether measured by the nobility of its purposes or by the efficacy of its results, the American founding deserves to be ranked among the greatest achievements in human history. Americans should be proud of that. It is altogether fitting, therefore, that the study of the founding should be undertaken with a measure of gratitude. Study of the founding commends itself for a third reason, which arises from the first two, yet is more important than either. Here the focus shifts from the Constitution as such to the Declaration of Independence. This shift is, in many respects, a matter of degree, for in the American founding, the two documents are uniquely, indeed, inextricably intertwined. To a man, the founders affirmed the argument of the Declaration as the moral precedent to good government. Most Americans today, I suspect, apprehend the common sense of the Declaration's moral argument without thinking much about it. In ordinary times, that would not be problematic, but as you may have had occasion to notice, these are no ordinary times. Indeed, it may be said that these are perilous times. And one measure of the peril is the tendency among academics and others who really ought to know better to treat the Declaration's argument as so much philosophical mumbo-jumbo. Contrary to the prevalent disposition of many of my professorial colleagues and other members of the chattering classes, I would like to venture this thought. The best reason to study the American founding is to learn that your rights did not drop from the beak of some heavenly stork or spring forth full-blown from the brow of chance. Before the Constitution undertook to secure rights, a compelling argument had to be made as to why they deserved to be secured in the first place. In these days especially, we need to revisit the moral argument of the Declaration and to remind ourselves in rather explicit fashion why that argument remains true not just for British subjects living on the east coast of what would become the United States of America, but true simply. Whether by choice or necessity, King George III was, by modern standards, a relatively benign despot. Nearly a century before the American Revolution, his royal predecessors had been forced to share power with Parliament. By the 1760s, however, Britain's American colonists would learn that they fared no better under the combined authority of king and parliament than they had against the king acting alone. In the revolutionary crisis that led to the dramatic confrontation of 1775 and 76, Americans did this extraordinary thing. What had begun as an argument for rights claimed under British law and custom now morphed into an argument that rights derived from the law of nature and nature's God. And with that turn, the American Revolution acquired an entirely new aspect. 241 years later, Americans, as I say, tend to underestimate the gravity and implications of that turn. We do so in part because we have forgotten why the argument became necessary in the first instance, and in part because we do not see the connection between the Declaration's argument and the security of our own rights. In the run-up to the Civil War, many Americans made the same mistake. The war, with its terrible toll of death and destruction, shook them from their slumbers and, aided by Mr. Lincoln's instructive mediation, reminded them that the Declaration's teaching was no mere philosophical window dressing. Lincoln, in my view, the most profound political thinker of modern times, understood that fact more deeply and long before anyone else. He wrote this in April of 1859. All honor to Jefferson, to the man who, in the concrete pressure of the struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times, and so to embalm it there, so that today and in all coming days it shall be a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression. Not long ago, it would have been unnecessary, perhaps even impertinent, to ask why we ought to study the founding. The answer would have been considered self-evident. What Lincoln once referred to as the mystic chords of memory would have prompted Americans to see, if only dimly, a connection between contemporary life and their origins as a self-governing people. At the very least, they would have affirmed that the Founding Fathers had done something quite extraordinary in the annals of the human race, something not only extraordinary but praiseworthy. Little of this may any longer be presumed. For one thing, there is the simple fact of ignorance. Numerous studies in recent decades confirm the notable decline in civic education. One such study, directed by General Josiah Bunting a few years ago, I will spare you the gory details, save one. Not only is there widespread ignorance concerning basic facts about major events in American history, there is a net loss of historical knowledge of major American events between freshman and senior years at major universities, including Harvard and Yale. Recent data from the Annenberg Center confirm the downward trend. In their most recent poll, 1/3 of respondents were unable to name a single branch of government. Perhaps the pollsters misled the respondents by indicating that there were 3 branches of government, when in fact, as all Holocaust students know, there are 4. Right? You have the kick the can down the road branch, that's known as Congress. You have the it's my can, not yours branch, that would be the executive. You have the nobody's kicking any can until we say so branch, that would be the judiciary. And of course, the 4th branch that says there is no can until we write a rule defining it, and provided further you file an environmental impact statement and first obtain a license to kick cans. That's your modern government, and that's no doubt why the respondents to the Annenberg poll were misled, and I know you all know this being students at Golden Cross. But lack of factual knowledge is not the only problem. In fact, it's the least problem in a way. Even more worrisome is how students understand what little history they do claim to know. Many students seem to have absorbed, without thinking about it, the reflexive moral relativism that pervades so much of modern culture. We might repair that deficiency easily enough were it simply a consequence of lassitude. What makes it particularly hard to repair is that historicism, or outright relativism, in diverse forms and bearing diverse labels, long ago made its way into textbooks and syllabi across a wide range of disciplines. Depending on the subject, this mode of thinking is sometimes explicitly asserted, but more often simply assumed. As far as the American founding is concerned, it has been the fashion in the most advanced intellectual circles to treat a study as at best a quaint historical undertaking, as if it were a specialized subfield of cultural anthropology. The idea that the founders have studied with roughly the same curiosity and sense of importance that attaches to the study of Hittite pottery fragments. This is not a new phenomenon. In the better part of the past century, the ideas of the founders, for the most part, were not only not seriously studied at the university level, they were at best ignored as historically irrelevant, or at worst disparaged as hopelessly unenlightened. Our education system and popular culture are now reaping the whirlwind of this century-long process of deconstruction. I'm obviously painting with a broad brush. There are certainly praiseworthy exceptions to this trend, not least your splendid Department of Political Science here, and others like it. But there's no question that the modern path of deconstruction has been decisively prepared by historians and political scientists who take a rather dim view of what used to be called the land of the free and home of the brave. The case in point is the work of Howard Zinn, late professor at Boston University and author of The People's History of the United States, with which some of you may be familiar. His sales for many years have averaged well over 100,000 copies a year, and cumulative sales are inching toward the 4 million mark. Among other things, the book made Professor Zinn a very wealthy man. It is the only history book, as far as I know, to be prominently featured in a popular motion picture. If you saw Matt Damon and Ben Affleck studying their stuff in Good Will Hunting, you might recall that Zinn's book was singled out for exceptional praise. If you poke around a bit online, you will discover that The People's History ranks very high on the popular read list, especially at colleges and university bookstores, and in towns where they are located. It is widely used as well as primary supplementary text in many secondary schools. You should know, in case you don't, that Zinn's history seethes with Marxist rage on almost every page. Far from being a noble enterprise, the American story is for Zinn essentially the story of how the rich and powerful have exploited the poor and the weak. The Declaration of Independence, in his view, is a cynical cover for a land grab on the part of rich colonists. The Constitution imposes rigid institutional devices that perpetuate capitalist exploitation. The Pilgrims and Puritans fare no better. They are portrayed as so many money-grubbing oppressors of Native Americans. Both sides in the Civil War are primarily animated by the pursuit of selfishness, profits, and greed. And on this goes for some 800 pages. I'll spare you some more details if you want to know. I can supply them later. Zinn's venom and shoddy historical methods would not be noteworthy but for the enormous influence of his work. His popularity, unlike that, say, of David McCulloch, is almost entirely a consequence of decisions made by high school teachers and college professors who require students to buy and read Zinn's book. A few years before he died, he received a standing ovation at a convention of high school social science teachers. Professor Zinn's disposition is an unusually poisonous example, to be sure. While many professional historians may be put off by Zinn's tone, spitefulness, and rigid Marxist dialectic, a large number nevertheless share philosophical notions that are not very far removed from his. The prevalent view among intellectuals these days seems to be that ideas are, in the end, but the verbal expression of a deeper and more important set of forces. For Zinn, these forces were mostly about social and economic class. For others, the decisively important phenomena are said to be race or gender. In the century before Zinn came to prominence, his intellectual path had been paved by progressive academicians whose work has asserted unusual influence over the study and teaching of political science and history. Perhaps the most important agent of change in this camp was a talented fellow with the name of Woodrow Wilson, of whom you may have heard. Long before he became a politician, he achieved notoriety as a professor of politics. He was a man with a mission, which was to change the way Americans understood their political tradition. It is not too much to say that Wilson bore a deep dislike, even contempt, for the regime established by the American founders. The Declaration's argument about the origin and nature of rights, he thought, expressed a once fashionable but now no longer credible 18th century worldview. The Constitution, for its part, instantiated that same outmoded worldview in the positive law. Federalism, bicameralism, staggered elections, separation of powers, and all of the other auxiliary precautions that the founders planted in the Constitution were, for Wilson, a needlessly convoluted recipe for democratic gridlock. All because the framers entertained hopelessly outdated beliefs about human nature, limited government, and individual rights. These beliefs, Wilson learned, imitated a simple-minded and almost unconscious manner, imitated in a simple-minded and almost unconscious manner the ethos of Newtonian mechanics, which contemplated a neatly ordered universe governed by immutable laws. It was time to say goodbye to all that, Wilson insisted. It was science, after all, and especially the science of human society, had made notable advances since the time of the founding. The old model based on Newtonian mechanics should give way to a new model based on the study of organic life, especially as revealed by the discoveries of Charles Darwin. Darwin had confirmed, Wilson believed, that nature was always in flux, demonstrating that the very idea of natural rights was no longer viable. Among other things, a constitution dedicated to securing natural rights prevented government from doing what Wilson and his fellow progressives believed it ought to do. A properly constructed constitution, by contrast, would adapt itself to constantly changing human needs and aspirations, much as an organism adapts to its physical environment. An explanation and critique of Wilson's thought will have to wait another time and place. I remark it here for a more immediate purpose, to emphasize that Wilson sought to effect a revolution in political thought, to supplant the revolution effected by the Founding Fathers. Wilson was hardly alone. His understanding was widely shared and acted upon, as I say, by multiple generations of progressive thinkers who transformed the teaching and practice of American politics more or less across the board. The greatest victory lies in the academy, where, with few exceptions, ideas of the sort popularized by Wilson remain the dominant force in the social sciences. This is what makes it terribly difficult these days to recapture the thought of the founders as it deserves to be understood. Preparing students to think seriously about such questions is, I pray, still the principal business of Holy Cross education in politics and government. Thinking seriously means that one has to push beyond the lazy and dogmatic skepticism of contemporary thought, which asserts that we cannot with any confidence know truth, or that all moral propositions stand on an equal footing, or that truth is merely a function of one's race, class, or gender. This school was erected on the proposition that certain truths are neither relative nor time-bound. It proudly asserts that you can, indeed must know important truths in order to lead a happy life. Truths about what is right and wrong, just and unjust, truths about who we are and whence we came, truths about the duties we owe to one another and to our Creator, truths about politics and government, perhaps all truths that do not depend for their validity on how many or what kind of people believe it. Allow me to leave you with this thought. In our time, relativism has taken a terrible toll. You know that already from your own experience. The air about you, if not here, then in the world at large, is saturated with skepticism. The fashionable term is postmodernism. And after you leave the comforts of Mount St. James, and perhaps even while you are still here, you will not be able to assume without argument the truths that have structured your lives here, or the truths on which American civilization was founded. You will encounter many students and noted professors elsewhere who will assert that reason is powerless to demonstrate why one value judgment is objectively superior to another. If you go to law school or happen to study American history or government in many graduate programs, you will be taught that the Founding Fathers may have been clever and perhaps even well-intended fellows, maybe, but we're now beyond all that. You almost certainly will not be taught that the moral arguments set forth in the preamble of the Declaration deserves your thoughtful attention. You will have to learn about that pretty much on your own. That's a sad commentary on our times, but the good news is that there are many thoughtful scholars and teachers, some of them in this very room, who stand ready to help you. Well, I end where I began. We should study the American founding not only because it's interesting, and not only because it happens to be our nation's founding. We should study it because it opens the door to permanent truths about the human condition, truths that we ignore at our peril. Don't take my word for it. Read George Washington and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson on your own and think about what they have to say. Argue with them. Decide for yourself whether they were merely exhibiting an 18th century worldview, or whether they had something compellingly important to say about how human beings everywhere ought to govern themselves. Before making your mind up, you should also visit Abraham Lincoln, who knew the answer to that question and a good deal more, and understood, as I hope you will, that your lives, your fortunes, and your sacred honors will depend on how you answer the question. Now go do the right thing. Thank you. I know you're there. Having spent a large part of my undergraduate career in alcoves at the Sterling Library of Yale, where I obtained most of my sleep, I know you're there. So good. Thank you.
Thank you. Happy to take some questions. If you guys have questions for Dr. Uhlmann, if there's anything, we'll start with some students and see how it goes. You guys have anything? Professor Uhlmann.
Who is softball? Right here. All right, maybe not. You look dangerous. Yeah.
So it was said in your introduction that you worked under the Ford and Reagan administrations. I was just wondering how applicable the Constitution was under your eyes during those administrations and how that's still carried throughout the administration.
Well, as to the first part of your question concerning President Ford, the man to ask was that man right there. He did a whole book on the subject showing how significant the Constitution was to Ford personally and to his administration in particular. It really, the burden of Professor Uhlmann's book is that it mattered a very great deal. In fact, it is, I think it's safe to say, the defining characteristic of the Ford administration. As to President Reagan, the Constitution is up there in front of you all the time. It's interesting. I have a half-written piece comparing Reagan's constitutional rhetoric with that of Barack Obama. I'll give you some sense of this. Reagan, in talking about today and the future, almost always attached it to the past. That we were continuing a tradition that had begun by the framers, and we should imitate the framers in the same way that they created the Constitution. And by trying to keep it right, we were imitating them in the best possible way. Almost always, President Obama, with a few conspicuous exceptions in referring to the past, did so in some critical or denigrating fashion. The past is something to be avoided. We are building the future by ourselves in some reconstructive way. That's not universally the case, but that's, if you wanted a gross tendency, there is the tendency. There were many occasions when the Constitution was very seriously debated within the White House. And it is the case, I've often said, that debates within the executive branch about constitutionality are much broader and deeper than most people have a sense of. They're every bit as broad and as deep as fights between the executive branch and Congress. And the short answer is, yeah, both administrations took the Constitution very seriously. Help?
Sure, there's one back there, actually, yeah. That's you. Yep.
You made a short comment earlier in your talk about kind of how the founding fathers have seen a revitalization through pop culture, through Hamilton. I was wondering if you think kind of that revitalization will have any effect on how future generations and our current generation views the Constitution and the founding fathers in any ways.
What did you tell me?
I mean, I
don't speak hip-hop. But it's an interesting cultural phenomenon, isn't it, huh? That you could put Alexander Hamilton on a stage in New York at $400 a pop, speaking hip-hop. Now, there's some political correctness to that, a lot of political correctness to that. I suppose it's an important phenomenon. I'm not a fan of that kind of thing, but that's me, and I'm an old guy. And, I would much prefer to sit down and talk with you about, say, the opening paragraph that Hamilton wrote for some known Publius in the Federalist Papers, where he advanced the proposition that it was an open proposition whether men were capable of establishing societies from reflection and choice, or whether they must forever depend for the constitutions on accident and force. That first paragraph of the Federalist is compelling. it reminds you of what a delicate thing the founding was. We take it for granted. They couldn't. They didn't. They had their fingers crossed. Because the reputation of democratic regimes from time immemorial was not a favorable one. What they tried to do was to construct one that acknowledged human nature in its frailty, but also open to the possibility of human beings at their best. Let me tell you a story. Some years ago I was laid up, and one of the books I read was a collection of stories about shipwrecked sailors from the 17th and 18th century. One of the stories was recorded by an English sailor who was marooned on a Pacific island. I think he had his knife with him, the tails escaped to some extent. So he was able to fashion a lean-to and spear some fish, and slice plantains and coconuts and so on. He was able to survive reasonably well. And with each passing week, he explored more and more of the island, and lo and behold, after about 2 months, he discovers on the other side of the island another marooned sailor who, by the grace of God, was also an Englishman. And what do? They form a political society, 2 citizens. They set up an oral constitution. You clean up a lean-to on Mondays. I get the coconuts on Tuesdays. You spearfish on Wednesdays. We have happy hour on Friday, smoking plantains and other controlled substances. There being no DEA in those days. This political society lasts about 2 months. They have a fight over something, maybe literally a food fight, but there was a fight, and they split, and each goes to a separate part of the island where they remain until some months later they're picked up by a passing vessel. That's how hard it is to establish a political society that lasts more than a short period of time. 2 human beings, economically self-sufficient, cannot establish a stable government. Now try doing that with multiple thousands, if not millions of people, and try to do it successfully. Try to do it in a way that takes account of you. Yes, I'm talking to all of you now. You on your worst day, that face you see in the mirror, the face you see from your brother and sister after you've been unusually nasty. That's the stuff you have to work with when you establish a government. And to do that at the same time while opening the possibility of government to what Madison called the better angels of your nature, that's the trick to keep the dark side controlled while opening it to the possibilities of some mobility. Madison caught this very nicely, as some of you know, in that famous passage in Federalist number 51, where he says, men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither internal or external controls would be necessary. But in establishing a society in which men govern men, you must first require that the governed be governed, that the citizens be governed, and then require that the government control itself. That contains a lot of political wisdom, and that's the philosophical premise on which the structure of the American Constitution is erected. The fascinating thing, I think, about the American founding is it took human beings as they were. They weren't saints, they weren't angels, they were just like you and me, and tried to do the best with that if they could. Significantly, every tyranny you ever heard of in the modern age, everything works as long as we change human nature. Right? So they will send you to re-education camps, and they don't shoot you. And either speaking in a German or Russian or Chinese accent, they're going to remake you to some kind of new man, and then we all live happily ever after. But it requires a radical change in nature. Not so with the French. This is a constitution made for ordinary human beings, like you and like me, and that's one of the reasons why it's worked reasonably well for a couple of hundred years, which is a pretty good track record for Republican governments. More than that, deponent saith no. Fair enough? And I think that's true, notwithstanding Hamilton and hip-hop. And besides, I don't have $400. Other questions? I've known them all to silence. We're interfering with the meeting.
It's coming out. Yeah. Oh, there's one. Riley.
A live one?
When you look at the way that the founders debated with one another, and then you look at the way that our Congress today kind of talks about problems within our society, do you think that like sound political debate is dying in this country?
Yeah. It's a complicated tale. I mean, you could build a whole course in political science around it, and I suspect the Reverend Brand is the man to talk to about that. Yeah, I mean, I think, not to be too pessimistic about it, yeah, there is a decline, not just in politics, but in general. If you follow the public prints over a couple of 100 years, the level of discourse is just like this. Don't leave college without reading the Lincoln Douglas debates, for example. The level of discourse is there. And it's before a lay audience packed with ordinary citizens like you and me. The level of discourse is extraordinary. There's a compounding problem with modern Congress, you know, like jocular reference to kick the can down the road branch and so on. It has to do with the rise of what we call the administrative state, which tends to eliminate debate. And this ultimately can be traced back to Wilson and his colleagues, who really did believe basic problems of government had been solved. And henceforth, the real problem of government were problems of administration. And the core focus was to pay attention to how things are done rather than what ought to be done. The latter was essentially solved at the margins, and to the extent it wasn't, it would be the president, not Congress, that would provide that insight. But experts, bureaucrats, rule makers, neutral, all neutral, would make the rules that would govern civil society. And what's happened, to make a long story short, in the course of the last century, is that Congress has receded more and more from substantive policy engagement. And indeed, in my view, the problem has been compounded because Congress now sees the administrative state as a means to its re-election. They have converted the instrumentalities of the administrative state into a process by which they can maximize their own re-election without addressing all sorts of complicated issues, whether it's healthcare or abortion or you name it. Congress is almost structured today to avoid debate on that subject. Once in a while it breaks out, but not routinely, and that's a serious problem, and I don't really know how to cure it. Prayer and fasting? Sometimes, you know, Plato was right. Sometimes perfect understanding of the problem doesn't help you to solve it. Yes?
If we were to give credit, as much credit as possible for the opponents of the Constitution, the progressives, how would you frame their understanding of the problem that drove them to abandon a political system that is as good as you say, or to change it in a way that they turned out so badly? What motivated well-intentioned and public-spirited men to engage in this project?
Well, at the philosophical level, it's Hegel all the way down. At the retail level, what I call retail level, I mean, there's serious problems of the regulation of social activity, the economy, and so on. I am of the view that you can have a pretty sizable government, a pretty vigorous sort, without all the baggage of historicism sort of embraced by the progressives. In fact, I'm optimistic enough to think I think the politics of the next generation is going to consist almost entirely of something like that. I think the sun is set on the high water of progressive enthusiasm philosophically. I think it's failed to produce the results. I mean, some of us were talking about this the other night. What some people call the blue state model, uniformly a failure. Name me a big city. Boston may be an exception, by the way, and that's worth studying, why Boston works. And name me another big city that works. You'd be hard-pressed. Some in the South, hurricanes exempted, right? But certainly not, all the great cities have Mid-Atlantic, Central States, they're almost all failures. And they're failures because they have adopted that spend, tax, elect philosophy made famous in the New Deal and compounded by the Great Society. So that you have such a huge proportion of the revenue going to support social redistribution so that nothing is left for a whole bunch of other things. 3 into 2 doesn't go. And they run out of money. Margaret Thatcher was right. Sooner or later, you run out of other people's money to make this thing. Now, if you look at this from the perspective of looking forward in the 1930s, you say, therefore, for the grace of God, go on. Right? Or even in the 1950s. But now, we don't have that virtue. We're now looking at that. So what portion of your national wealth do you want to spend on redistributed issues? Right? You can run the numbers yourself. You don't need an old crank like me. You look at Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. How many here are looking for what they're going to receive in Social Security? It's funny, I didn't see any hands. Amazing. You know this. How did that happen? Social Security is a Ponzi scheme. You don't know what a Ponzi scheme is? We send people to jail for doing Ponzi schemes. All right? Your government does it regularly, and you're not going to see a penny. But I do thank you. As an old guy, I thank you very much for your generosity under Social Security. Medicaid is a slightly revised version of that. Medicare so far is working, but last time I looked, we have an aging population. Multiple choice question. With an aging population and government subvention of health markets, is healthcare going to cost you more or less? Pick one. Now, where is that money going to come from? That's right, it's going to come from you. And I know you want to be generous to people like me, and I'm not feeling too well today. You don't mind to subsidize my visit to the doctor? Some years ago, I was teaching an undergraduate class at Claremont McKenna. We were debating the pro and con. This was in 07 when the Obamacare bill was pending in the House. And we had a good food fight about it. And I went home over the weekend, came in on Monday morning. I said, I've solved it! I went anxiously, looking forward to it. I said, take your pencil. I said, you should pay for my health care. They were stunned. I said, yeah, well, I think you should. I have no objection to it. I think it's a wonderful principle. I have no objection to it whatsoever. I think you should all pay for it. Well, okay. And they argued simply. Now, half of you at least were perfectly prepared to endorse that principle for the body politic, but you won't pay for mine. But that actually started a very interesting conversation about what you're going to do. Here is the broken model. If you look down the federal budget, don't leave Holy Cross without actually looking at the federal budget. Right? What they spend money on. It's all good at some level. But at some point, somebody has to say no. And the politics of the next generation are going to revolve around who says no to what. And defining the who and defining the what is going to define the politics of the next generation. There's no question about it. That's a function of math. It's not terribly complicated. And your generation is going to be centrally involved in all this. And while we're working that out, of course, there will be no problems on the international front. The North Koreans will have peace in our time with us. You don't have to worry about the Chinese or the Russians, so we don't have to worry about any of that. We can just worry about how to reorder our domestic priorities. So the short answer to that very complicated question is that we're spending too much on too many things, and it cannot go on forever. Herb Stein, the famous economist, had a great line. He said, if something can't go on forever, it will stop. And that's exactly where we are now, it seems to me, with the entitlement state. 62% of federal revenues are now spent on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. That number is rising. The curve is rising, rising this way. Right? It's not going that way. Right? And you can run the numbers in 2033 or something. Social Security goes into permanent deficit. Permanent deficit. There will not be enough taxpayers, that's you, to fund people like me. I'll be gone by then, there's going to be a lot more me's behind me. Social Security will be flat, broke, and every year will take more and more out of the economy because there's nobody paying in anymore. When Social Security was established, the ratio was what, 20 workers or something, 27 workers to one recipient. That ratio is now about 3 to 1, 2.5, 3 to 1. And by 2030, it's going to be negative. There'll be more recipients perhaps than taxpayers. It's going to be close. That's Social Security. I'm not touching Medicare and Medicaid, which are even in worse shape financially. That is over. That game is over. It's a real question. It's a fascinating question from a political point of view. You're not going to be able to avoid dealing with that question, my fellow citizens. You need to think about this one seriously and to figure out how you can have a society with enormous wealth, how you can have a just and humane society that orders an intelligent redistribution of resources without turning it into a Ponzi scheme. That's an interesting challenge, philosophically, politically, and it's going to fall to your generation to do it. The old guys don't know what to do about this. They're just spinning their wheels. Back to your question about Congress, that's one reason why everything I said to you, they know in spades. They know it's true. They don't know how to solve it. It's going to fall to your generation. Now here's a $1 million political idea. I give it to you for nothing. Some of you need to go out there to form a youth counterpart to the AARP. Everybody know what the AARP is? Right? Well, I think it will shock you. It's an insurance company. That's what it is. 60-odd% of its revenues come from the sale of insurance to oldies. I don't buy it, a lot of people do. But they are a very effective lobby for old people. Congress goes into heebie-jeebies when the AARP does it. There is no organized group representing 20 and 30-somethings. Go found it. Get yourself a seat at the table. Pound the table. Pay attention to the politicians. They will pay attention to you. But you have to organize and do it because now it's an open field. Get a seat at the table. Do this. Sooner or later somebody's going to do it. It might as well be you. And you'll get rich in the process. That's the American way. And you don't need Hegel for all this. All this philosophical, metaphysical baggage, the German ideals. You don't need any of this stuff. You combine all that, you can have a just, humane, and intelligently large government without all that deterministic baggage. Trust me, you can. So the philosophers have to figure that part of it out. You guys do the practical part. And go elect some congressmen who care about this and threaten them with their lives. They'll pay attention. The system still works.
So, another question. Sure, right there.
Yeah.
To what extent would you blame
So could you stand up real quick?
Yeah.
Thanks.
To what extent would you blame apathy for like all the problems you were talking about instead of the politicians? Like I think there's a statistic that most American, the average American believes that we spend a quarter of the budget on foreign aid, when it's actually like 1 or 2%, and they don't know about like Social Security. They think it's much lower, so they know nothing, and then they have people who just give into what they're saying. Just
yeah. What are you going to do about it?
I would vote for someone.
But you see, apathy knows no range. They have to roll their sleeves up and do something about it. People do. They're one of the engaging things about America, is the extent to which large segments of this population, in fact, roll their sleeves up, despite government, and do things. It's amazing. It's amazing. I'll give you one example. The growth of the charter school movement. I spent a number of years working very aggressively in school choice in Wisconsin. And out of that grew diverse efforts having to do with charter schools. Parents have had it up to here in many places. Not in Massachusetts, but the schools are apparently pretty darn good. God bless you. But in other places, it isn't. And so what they do is parents roll their sleeves up and say, I'm not taking this anymore. We need to do something. There's a lot more of that in modern society than you would think. It's a nice avenue for political research. There's more research going along that line. Some of the guys at the American Enterprise Institute are poking at this. There's more of that going on than you think. And the way to reduce apathy, I think, I don't know, good moms and dads start there. So when you go get married, have kids, be good moms and dads. That's how you sheer apathy, and put some juice in the schools. Maybe teach useful mythology in the schools, teach them about the American founding, teach them that George Washington didn't chop down the cherry tree, or maybe he did, and he didn't want to tell a lie about that. Then later you can tell them the full story. When they're young, work on it. They'll repair their deficiencies. I worry about how they turn off the television. Start there. I don't know. I can't answer. You do something about it. No, I'm not being frivolous. It's an important question. Yeah, there is what accounts for apathy, but there's lots of psychological studies about what causes this. Especially in affluent societies, people are fat, dumb, and happy. But when the bad stuff hits the fan, it tends to concentrate their mind. And one of the real issues, to go back to what I said a few minutes ago, for your generation, is going to be what happens when this blue model, as we call it, collapses, more or less. Will people turn to some demagogic savior? He says, I'm going to make it nice, don't worry, go watch football on Sundays and backyard barbecues, I'm going to make it nice. Or will people resolve to do something about themselves in some intelligent way? That's an interesting question, and I have a good answer to that. We're in an upsy downsy period at the moment. We need to watch the ball game and have politics very carefully from here on out. But I think that's what's an issue. The tectonic plates in American politics are shifting. There's going to be a redefinition of what the public wants and how it wants it. The politicians are going to supply the answer, and you ought to be there to help them supply the right answer. Okay. Go back to your question.
What things? What are thoughts? Yeah, Brennan.
How would you, in your opinion, resolve the tension that surrounds the interpretation of the Constitution?
Of whose interpretation?
The interpretation of the Constitution at the judicial level. You have individuals like the late Antonin Scalia and Justice Thomas who constantly, in their rhetoric, address the framers and the intent behind the founding, and then you have individuals like Stevens that view more it as an evolving.
Yeah, how much time do you have? This is a whole course. Yeah, it's a wonderful question. In a lot of ways, it's the central question of modern constitutional jurisprudence. The fight between the so-called originalists and the so-called living constitutionalists. My pal Scalia used to say, I'm in favor of the dead Constitution. He was being provocative. But he'd do it because he'd say, and he'd point to the ACLU types in the audience. He said, you can count on me because that Constitution is going to mean the same thing today, tomorrow, next year, and the year after that when you're dealing with me. I'm not going to make it up as I go. And he'd point to one of his liberal colleagues. He said, my pal Breyer, you got to worry about because he's going to change it to pragmatic circumstance. So stick with the oldies and the dead Constitution. Well, hyperbole aside, the issue fundamentally is this. Why have a written Constitution at all? That's one question. The second question is, well, now that you have it, how are you going to interpret it? The Constitution doesn't come with a section that says how to read this document. And if it did come with such a section, we'd be fighting over the meaning of that. That's what it means to be human. The Constitution has some opaque, not many, but some opaque provisions and some deliberately ambiguous provisions in it. One example, in Article 2, which creates the presidency, it vests the executive power in a president. It doesn't define the executive power. So what's the proper way to understand the executive power? Well, here is what you bring to that text. You bring a lot of historical knowledge from the British Constitution, bring an understanding from the Federalist Papers and other contemporary documents. You might bring some later documents in, but the question would be, what becomes a legitimate extraneous device to use as a matter of interpretation? And there is where you get inside baseball fights about what counts as a legitimate interpretive device. On the original side, and I'm generally in that camp, if you have a written Constitution, it has a range of meanings like this, not like that. And the problem with living constitutionalism is that I don't know where the limit is. And the question I like to pose, which Professor Hyman posed in his common law class today, is ask yourself this question: can the Supreme Court ever make a mistake? What's the answer? How do you know?
How do I know?
How would you know?
Because they're human too.
Well, the only way you would know is that there's some understanding of the Constitution against which the court's decision can be measured. Now, what is that understanding? Capisce? Yeah, I mean, but the framers understood this. I mean, in this complicated business of setting up a tripartite system of government, it's so infuriating to Europeans, especially, even to modern students. Because you're inclined to think Professor Hyman was lecturing on this today. You're inclined, because you're of this generation, the Supreme Court decides constitutional things. Well, that is a late 20th century phenomenon. The framers didn't think so. John Marshall didn't think so. That isn't what Marbury versus Madison says, quite the contrary. Right? In establishing a tripartite scheme of government, all three branches have an opportunity to define constitutional meaning, right? Each within its own sphere of activity, and at the margins, it isn't always clear where that sphere is. Right? So I was only partly joking when I talked about the kick the can down the road branch versus it's my can. That goes on all the time in arguments between Congress and the executive. You know who understood this perfectly? James Madison. It is anticipated the Constitution will produce that kind of conflict. Ultimately, it requires a political resolution. There's no other way around it. Words can't compel an answer. They can point in the direction. Some parts of the Constitution, yeah, they're settled by mere words, but the larger questions, they require a kind of interpretation. But there are better and worse interpretations, and I think originally they lie in here, not in here. This defeats the entire purpose of having a written constitution. What do you think? I mean, I think it's a compelling argument. It's the right answer. You're nodded at all the right places. Very wise one.
Other things? Other questions? Is there one? No, I missed it. Okay, I'll take the last liberty here. How could you make the case for the Declaration? You talk about Howard Zinn's position as reflecting some structural inequalities that exist in the society. What would be the best argument you could make for the Declaration as a social justice document?
Well, I would start by asking that face in the mirror where your rights come from. Where do you think they come from? I've never had a student who really thought they came from the government. It was sometimes mumbled for me. They didn't really believe it. Because if the government's the source of rights, the government can unsource the rights. So as good Americans, most, you don't believe that. You want some extraneous source of rights to check the government. And that arises partly out of self-interest and partly out of a metaphysical argument. That quickie allusion I made in my text to that process, it's really astounding, by which the framers moved from roughly the early 1760s to roughly the mid-1770s. They moved from earthbound arguments based on custom and the rights of Englishmen to an abstract proposition that rights simply, because you are a human person with dignity, there's a ground in nature to that dignity, and it's expressed here in this document. And you're free to disagree with it. You can take a walk. Right? If you're a free person, you can affirm or deny that. If you do affirm it, then you can be a fellow citizen. I say to some of my radical students, because they're philosophically radical or politically so, I said, you and I, to be fellow citizens, must acknowledge some common basis of citizenship beyond the Constitution. Otherwise, I have to stay up all night with my shotgun. You may come get me. But if you and I can agree that our rights derive from a common source, and that we are equal in possession of those rights, I can count on your self-interest to check my behavior. If you can count on mine, that becomes the preliminary basis for a civil order in which we can agree to disagree. In some respects, The American regime sets up a system in which, well, let me back up a step. It's been said with some accuracy that the election of 1800, if you think contemporary politics is bitter, you ain't seen nothing until you look at the election of 1800, where both sides were convinced the other was illegitimate. They really meant it. But the election occurs in a complicated and passionate way. And power is transferred from the outs, from the ins to the outs, without shots being fired. As one of my tutors once said, it's the first known occasion in history, any sort of large system, in which power passed from the ins to the outs by ballots rather than bullets. That's, in a sense, what the Declaration points to. But it's based on the mutual recognition that we possess equal rights. Right? Jefferson says this very well in his first inaugural. He says, the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, but that will to be rightful must be reasonable. If the minority possess equal rights to violate which would be oppression. You could say the American Constitution, deriving from the principle of the Declaration, is devoted to the creation of reasonable majorities, those which by the nature of their composition are disinclined, right, to empower tyrannical majorities. It doesn't always work, but that's the principle of the thing. Otherwise, the Constitution by itself doesn't guarantee anything in the way of rights. It's the Declaration feeding its metaphysics, so to speak, into the Constitution that gives it life. And rightly understood, at least Lincoln so understood. And I think the framers so understood. Lincoln, in that sense, revived the teaching of the framers and, if anything, elevated the importance of the Declaration because he had 70 years of understanding to see where the framers may not have quite gotten that right. But that's a delicate argument. But there's an example, and I'm proud of that. It's what I paid. But that's one of the lovely things about studying American politics. All of these wonderful questions, they're not things on which you can be dogmatic. I think you can be thoughtful. The problems we face today are not novel. In the end, they fall back on who you are as human beings. This clay that made the good part and the bad part. Now, how do you put yourselves together in a way that's stable? Well, there could be rules for this. Well, the wonderful thing about the American Times, in those thousands of volumes you can dip into, it takes you back to that debate. There's very little they didn't think about in terms of how you assemble society. They also gave you principles on which you might become fellow citizens. I'm not that smart to be able to come up with a principle better than establishment of government and what's set forth in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. I think it's pretty good. I think it's as good as the human mind can comprehend about the basis of government. What would the alternative be? A confessional state? That's one possibility. We tried that. It worked too well. A state based on who's got the bigger club? That doesn't work too well, I don't think. So what's your alternative? That's where, for all its limitations, that second paragraph of the Declaration begins to look very good. They thought their way through this in a rather dramatic kind of way. You know, I often say that one thing we forget, you know, Americans between the founding, the first colonies in the early part of the 17th century, through the formal founding of what we call the Constitution, had 150 years of hands-on experience with self-governing institutions. You could say in that 150-year period, there was more experience with self-governing institutions on the eastern shore of the United States than existed in the entire history of the world beforehand. Remarkable. And they learned something from it in this interesting combination of Lockean metaphysics, Scottish Enlightenment thought, Calvinist theology, and earthbound, dirt under the fingernails experience. That's the combination of the American founding, and it's put together in an extraordinary way by an extraordinary group of people in an extraordinarily short period of time. And we're all here because of that, and we should say thank you.
With that, let's thank Professor Uhlmann.